Hello and welcome to Season 5, Episode 18 of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Christina Hagen, coming to you live from Cape Town. And now this is the third in our special series of webinars as part of the build-up for the South African Bird Fair, which is happening this weekend. And I'm also very pleased to welcome John Kinghorn as a co-host of Conservation Conversations. Welcome, John.
No, thanks so much, Christina. So thank you everybody for joining. Conservation Conversations is remarkable. We have over 160 episodes recorded, which are of course all available on YouTube as well, which is fantastic. If you happen to miss an episode and you can't tune in live, you can always go back to our YouTube channel and have a look, see what you missed. And of course, catch up. So it's fantastic. In order to do so, you need to make sure that you like and subscribe to the BirdLife South Africa YouTube channel. It is relatively straightforward unless you have the technology skills of me, in which case you might struggle. But normally it is quite easy.
Yes, and we are on all major social media channels, so you can use the hashtag Conservation Conversations to let us know what you think of the show.
Of course, we aim to keep these conservation conversations free for everybody to learn and enjoy from. So if you are willing to contribute, it would be truly, truly appreciated. You can do so simply by having a look at our website, www.birdlife.org.za, or you can simply scan the QR code displayed on your screen at the moment. Any donations, be it big or small, would be greatly appreciated.
Now, the annual BirdLife South Africa raffle is live, and you can stand a chance to win an 8-day, 7-night birding trip for two to Brazil, which is an absolute bucket list birding location. It promises to be an absolutely amazing trip. So you can visit our website, birdlife.org.za/raffle for more and to buy your tickets.
Of course, this Saturday, we have the ever-popular South African Bird Fair taking place at the Country Club of Johannesburg in Woodmead. So for all of you Gauteng-based birders here in South Africa, it would be fantastic to have you come along and join us for a day celebrating birds and bird conservation. You do need to make sure that you go and visit the website. Make sure that you get your ticket as well. That is this Saturday at the Country Club of Johannesburg. We will also be live streaming some of the events for free, so keep your eyes peeled to this channel as well.
And as part of the Bird Fair, we are offering a very special membership discount of 15% off your membership fee if you become a member between now and midnight on Saturday, the 24th of August. So if you've ever been slightly tempted to join BirdLife, now is the time to do so. And you can also stand a chance to win a fantastic pair of Zeiss binoculars.
Now, of course, some of you may know that we are running this week's Conservation Conversations as part of a 3-part limited series, and it does include fantastic talks from Fancy Peacock, Peter Kastner, who has seen 10,000 species of bird in the world, first person ever to do so. And tonight we have Keith Barnes, who will be presenting his Birding Greater Southern Africa book, which is a fantastic new publication that's been released by Helm Books.
Yeah, so unfortunately, Keith couldn't be with us tonight as he is currently leading a tour, but he has recorded his presentation for us. Keith Barnes started off as a scientist, and he was actually working on BirdLife South Africa's important bird and biodiversity area and red data book projects in the late 1990s, as well as being masochistic enough to delve into research into lark systematics. But he later segued into birding and nature-based tourism and is an owner and director of the international tour operator Tropical Birding. So we're sad not to be able to have Keith with us, but we do have his presentation, which he recorded, which I will play for you now as soon as I can get the bright screens going. And I will start playing. So I hope everyone enjoys.
I'm Keith Barnes, and this is BirdLife South Africa's Conservation Conversations. A little bit of a tongue twister, that one. Glad I got through that. Okay, so today I'm joining you to chat a little bit about the birds of Greater Southern Africa. It's a new book released by Jonathan Ball Publishing in May of 2024. Though it's been released in the United Kingdom and in the United States by Bloomsbury and Princeton, respectively. And the subject of today's talk is a little bit about, well, the book, the history of the book, my own personal history, the origins of the project, and then what makes this book different, what makes it exciting and unusual, and finally, what lies beyond that. What can we expect beyond the book? What does the future hold for us? Okay, well, thanks very much for joining me, and let's move on. Well, I'm sure almost all of you are completely aware that a project like this is not a one-man show. I was lucky to be surrounded by a number of incredibly skilled, competent, and talented collaborators that I'm going to introduce you to. But first, myself. So I was the lead author on the project, and that required me to do a fair bit of collaboration and thinking, creating ideas and frameworks, etc. So my history, my first sort of venture in publications was the Important Bird Areas of Southern Africa and the ESCOM Red Data Book of South Africa, Lesotho and Swaziland, both conservation projects, both BirdLife South Africa projects. Those were done in the window from 98 to 2000. But both of those projects involved a fair amount of collaboration with other ornithologists around Southern and South Africa in particular, putting the stuff together, making the teams work. So I was, that was a very, very handy background for me. And then the three projects below are all Princeton University Press projects: Birds of Kruger National Park, Wildlife of Madagascar, and the Animals of Kruger National Park. And these were more sort of popular literature publications, reaching across the divide from science to casual birders and naturalists, and trying to get them to sort of enjoy their first birds and stuff. So I had a good grounding in both the scientific side of things as well as the collaborative side of things, but then also the popular literature. But I was exceptionally lucky on the authorship side of things to be joined by Terry Stevenson at the top, who's a tour leader for field guides, and John Fanshawe down below, who has been employed by BirdLife International for 3 decades or more, I believe. And these two gentlemen were responsible for perhaps the most landmark publications in African birding literature, The Birds of East Africa and The Birds of the Horn of Africa, two incredible books that really, really changed the way I certainly felt about bird guides and what they could achieve in a continental perspective. And as great as the authors are, the people who write the text, the litmus test of any real field guide project comes from the quality of the artwork. And there's no doubt in that regard, we were just absolutely blessed with what I believe are the best bird artists painting birds in Africa. That's John Gale over there, who's busy working on a 12-wired bird of paradise at a display post poking above the lowland tropical forests of New Guinea. And Brian Small is the other main artist on the project. And both of these guys have been painting African birds for 25 odd years, and as they do it more and more, they just get better. So those are the two primary artists on the project, but we also had a guest artist. I'm sure many of you know who Fancy Peacock is. It was really, really cool that Fancy was able to assist us with his amazing larks. We all know that LBJs are Fancy's one of his favorite groups, but larks happened to be something I worked on for nearly 10 years as a PhD study, which was probably way too long, but nevertheless, they're one of my favorite groups too. So it was really, really cool having Fancy work on the larks. But it's not just the people who write and are the painters or illustrators in the book that you work with. You end up working with tons and tons of other people, several worthy of a mention. Guy Kerwin and Nigel Redman, both ornithologists and people who have written plenty of books of their own were the editors for the project. Incredibly helpful, finding plenty of mistakes and helping us fine-tune things. And then I've used this nudibranchs slide because Julie Dando, who was the designer and the main person responsible for doing many of the digital manipulations on the illustrations, I couldn't even find a picture of her. So she's a bit like a nudibranch, very difficult to find, but an exceptional thing once you do find it. She was awesome, and yeah, just an incredible, cool team of people to do a project like this with. So very, very, very cool. So as always with most people, I think their parents are pretty pivotal in their development, and I was no different. This is circa 1982. I'm about 10 years old. I'm there with my dad. He's teaching me some incredibly important life skills, how to pour a medium cream sherry and make an Irish coffee. I'm pretty sure you'd be in jail for parenting like that these days, but that's the beauty of 1982. But the important thing is that my parents were actually birders themselves, and so I got into birding pretty much through them. I'll never forget that maybe the moment that is the eureka moment, my spark bird, was when we were heading off on a family vacation to the Drakensberg Mountains in about 1984 or 1985, and my dad had been prattling on about this bird he really wanted to see, which was the bearded vulture or lammergeier. I pulled out all his bird books. I remember it was that old 1985 Roberts by Gordon McLean, and you know, read up on everything and had to sit him down. You know, being 13 years old, of course I already knew everything, and you know, I said to him, Dad, you're not going to see this bird. And he was like, why, Keith? And it was, well, you know, this is a rare bird, and there's only 200 or so of them, and we're common people, and as far as my mind worked, common people didn't see rare things. But the beauty of it all was that I'd actually learned the ID features of this bird. I'm lucky, because it's a bird that happens to have some pretty easy to remember ID features. But we had done the rhino horn walk up into the Drakensberg that day, and so when this bearded vulture came over us about 25 meters right overhead, I can remember seeing that little black tuft on its chin, literally with my naked eyes. I went into complete meltdown. It wasn't somebody telling me I was seeing a rare thing. It's something I knew because I'd done the research. And so that was the moment I became a birder. And within a couple of years, I was absolutely obsessed, OCD big time. And I knew it was something that I would somehow have to include for the rest of my life. So like many people who are interested in birds and birding and ornithology as such, I went off to the University of Cape Town, where I eventually wound up at the FITS and ended up working on birds for a living. Now, the important thing about the university years was that was where I really first came into contact with Malawi and Zambia for the first time. I was lucky in that my old man wasn't just into birds, but he was a Brit, so I had this British passport. And although a lot of my birding buddies couldn't go birding in countries like Zambia and Malawi because of apartheid and South Africans' restrictions in going there, I was allowed to do that. And then I worked out, of course, that it was cheaper for me to head up to Malawi and spend my birding, I mean my university vacations in Malawi than it would have been if I'd stayed at home, especially the way I lived in those days. So I would regularly hitchhike or find a way to get up to Malawi or Zambia, and I would spend most of my summer vacations birding and enjoying those countries when very few other people could, which was pretty cool. One of the problems, of course, was that there was absolutely no literature for those parts of the world. So what literature did exist was very, very limited. And so often I would end up making notes, old school stuff, a little notebook would come out, and I'd have to have these ridiculously long one-page notes about birds. And then I would come back to the Fitzpatrick Institute, and I would end up having to go through scientific keys, as you can see here. This is one from the rather crazy Praed and Grant books that you can see up there at the top. This one, and there's multiple volumes covering the region there. So it can, that's my book over there. It's minute and compact compared to the old books we used to have to use to ID these birds. But of course it was, pretty interesting stuff, having to go through a key to try and identify a bird. And I'll never forget, this bottom right image is of a plate from the birds of Greater Southern Africa. I'm sure many of you will recognize the bar-throated apalis up there at the top, but just beneath it you'll see a bird that's very, very similar to bar-throated apalis, but much more yellow underneath with this green back and cap. And I'll never forget seeing that bird in Zomba Plateau. The very first time I laid eyes on that, I was incredibly excited. I knew what it kind of what it was, because I knew it wasn't a apalis, but I also knew that it was different from a bar-throated apalis. It was bright yellow. It was very interesting. I was absolutely giddy with this discovery. And when I returned to the FITS and went through the books, I was absolutely gutted to discover that in those days they regarded it as just a subspecies of bar-throated apalis. And so I not only, it was like just this deflation of finally realizing, oh my goodness, I actually haven't seen this new bird. Of course, within 10, 15 years later, with the way splitting went, they split this bird. It's now called the yellow-throated apalis. So when I did it in Birds of Greater Southern Africa, it had its own name. It's a Malawi endemic. It's really, really cool. So it's come full circle, as in, it was a bird that I saw that I thought was a new bird, which turned out not to be considered a new bird by McWhirth, Praed and Grant. But 10, 15 years later, you never know what you're going to get. And if you don't like the taxonomy, just do your own bird book and you can decide whatever you want. But fair enough, most authorities consider this different, and it's an exciting new little bird. But that's kind of how I came to discover Malawi and Zambia. It was, through an avenue of having very few resources, having to do things the hard way. And yeah, it's kind of really, really nice to put a cap on it by finally being involved in a book that does these regions justice. So, I mean, also back in the day, there were no commercial trips offshore to go and look at seabirds, no Zest for Birds or Cape Town pelagics or anything like that. So I had to do things the hard way. I ended up studying longline fisheries and getting on the boats themselves and going out to sea with fishermen. That was the only way I could get experience of many of the offshore seabirds out there. And it's kind of true that a lot of my scientific endeavor ended up being driven by what birds I could get for my list. And so it ended up being inevitable that maybe I would segue into something different outside of science, being mostly interested in birds and natural history. And that happened around 2001, where I started with a couple of buddies a bird tour company called Tropical Birding Tours. Like most of these things, it's not an overnight success. We had to bust the gut for the first 5 to 10 years to get things going, but it's kind of exciting that now we're running hundreds of tours around the world to lots of different places, but that's another topic. The cool thing was that I ended up being able to travel to lots of crazy different places, including Papua New Guinea, the Tibetan Plateau, Ecuador. And what that did was not only exposed me to birds like lesser frigate bird or black-naped tern, or birds like Isabeline wheatear and northern wheatears on the Tibetan plateaus. So I was able to not just experience these rarities, birds I would very rarely experience if I'd only sort of stayed in Southern Africa, but I was also able to use maybe hundreds is a strong word, certainly 50, 60, 70 different field guides around the world, learn what I liked about those field guides, what I didn't like about those field guides, what frustrated me about the field guides, what I really, really enjoyed about the field guides. But overall, it's been a great journey. I've been able to, see 99% of the birds that occur in the Birds of Greater Southern Africa and actually get good field experience with them, not just in passing, but actually get to understand the birds rather well. What has happened subsequently is, although I was using McWhirth, Praed and Grant, along came 2 field guides shortly after that. The Birds of Malawi was a supplement to Ken Newman's Birds of Southern Africa, and he basically just treated the birds that occur in Malawi that don't didn't occur in Southern Africa. And then a small field guide to Zambian birds, which was by Dylan Aspinwall and Carl Beal. And that did something similar. Published in 1992 and 1998 respectively. I just kind of assumed that sooner or later somebody would do dedicated field guides to these great countries with cool birds, but it never really ever seemed to happen. And so Malawi, Zambia, northern Mozambique, Angola, these have kind of remained regions that really haven't had great resources for a very long time. And that was a lot of the motivation to do Birds of Greater Southern Africa. And then, of course, maybe the game-changing moment. This is a plate from the Birds of East Africa by Stevenson and Fanshawe, but this is an illustration by John Gale. And what's amazing about this is when I saw this book, it was just like, it was the eureka moment. It was like, finally, world-class field guides for a region with absolutely immaculate illustrations. Now, this John Gale plate is so good that it's still in circulation nearly 25 years later. So I think the point is here that we had, you know, this world-class book coming out. I absolutely loved it. And slowly this idea began to gestate that maybe we could take this work that these guys had done and turn it into a field guide that covered Zambia and Malawi and northern Mozambique, but also included the rest of Southern Africa. So apologies to any of the ladies out there. I know calling calling this gestation and birth sort of, you know, trying to call it a pregnancy may be a little bit of a stretch. But I mean, given I'm a man, this is as close as I'm ever going to come to incubating and giving birth to something in my life. So we signed a contract in around 2017, I think, to do the book, and it was ticking along slowly, but I was probably spending more time running around the world looking at birds until the dreaded COVID arrived. And as I'm sure most of you will know, bird tour operators like myself were pretty much shut down. And for a while, I basically spent a lot of time just trying to get other folks work, but then eventually, you know, I realized, well, this was a great opportunity to work on these passion projects that I'd had and do it in a way where my thought streams weren't being interrupted and I didn't have other small things distracting me, etc., etc. And so this was the real period where we kicked on and did the vast majority of the work for the Birds of Greater Southern Africa. I'm sure many of you folks will think, well, you know, you sit down and you start penning the account for ostrich. But I can tell you that it was months, if not years of work beforehand, before we even began to put any text down. So what it really begins as is over here, you'll see there's this kind of massive taxonomic analysis of what subspecies and races are in each region, who treats them as what. You align the 4 different major global treatments up. You then include what's happening in the Roberts books, because, you know, the great handbook of Roberts, that's the main thing we faced. And then you try and work out what you're going to do in your book. And then over here, it was just a basic, like working out which species are going on which plates, how many words you've got on each plate, how many words you're going to be able to use for each species, and how that pans out. It really isn't straightforward at all, and it takes a fair bit of planning before you can even start doing stuff. The second sort of major undertaking is then to sit down with the artists and work out, what are you going to illustrate? You know, are these animals going to be flying? Are they going to be perched? Are they going to be underwings? Are they going to be adults? Are they going to be males and females? Are they going to be immatures? And how are these going to pan together in terms of design? And then over here, you know, we had a whole lot of questions related to the literature. So the literature is not always 100% accurate. I'm sure it's not even 100% accurate in our book, but we did our best to make sure it was as accurate as possible. But you know, sometimes you'd have to go into a place like the British Museum and get the field skins out and work out what's the variation like. What are these racial differences between the birds in our region and the birds in East Africa, etc., etc. So a lot of work behind the scenes that maybe most people don't really think about. Then, of course, the artists would submit the illustrations to you, and you'd have to go through them with a fine-tooth comb, making sure they matched your text, making sure every single bare part and eye color was right, making sure that, you know, the proportions were perfect, etc., etc. So tons and tons of background work. Last of all, yeah, some of the maps. I thought I'd just give you the maps as I was doing them. So hand-drawn maps for how things pan out, and you sit with 10 different reference works out there on different distributions, and you know, you're then dealing with breeding birds, non-breeding birds, resident birds, etc., etc. So quite a convoluted process. And then last but not least, up here, I had this whole document for digital manipulations that needed to be done for the document. So maybe unlike other projects where every illustration comes from scratch, we had plenty of illustrations that were very, very good. Let's say purple-crested turako, for example, but it's a slightly different subspecies. And so Julie Dando, who was absolutely magnificent, would have to go in there and put a slightly more pinkish purple hue on the chest, using some digital manipulation techniques so that we represented the local races rather than the races from East Africa. And voila, a few years later, you've got a book in your hands. So yeah, that was pretty much the process. A lot of work from a lot of people, but eventually we have a book. So what makes birds of Greater Southern Africa different? Well, of course, we're dealing with Zambia, Malawi, northern Mozambique, and the oceanic islands to the south of the African continental region for the first time. So there's just a graphic considering the entire region. You know, after apartheid ended and South Africans were allowed to travel to these countries, I just assumed that they would go there and, you know, enjoy it. And they simply haven't. So very few venture north of the Kunene and the Zambezi. And the net result is that these places are some of the most neglected birding regions in the entire African continent. I think there are big chunks of East Africa that are much better known than a lot of those countries just to the north of the classical Southern Africa region. And, you know, somewhere like Ghana, for example, it just seemed crazy to me. So it was exciting to develop resources for these places. Not only were they very important in my early career as a young birdist / ornithologist, and I love them. I love these regions. I wanted to include them. People sort of said to me, well, why don't you just make a guide for Zambia and Malawi? But that would kind of be missing the point to a certain extent, because although you would then have great resources for Zambia and Malawi alone, most Southern Africans still wouldn't realize what's sitting on their doorstep. There's an absolute treasure trove of magically cool birds sitting right on Southern Africans' doorsteps, and they don't really know it because they don't have a book that they appear in. Another reason why I wanted to include or tie the classic Southern Africa region to Zambia, Malawi, and northern Mozambique, and to the oceanic areas, is because it's really, really cool to have this sense of what's around you, and that it doesn't just exist in isolation. You know, that kind of seems like a lot of the narrative around the old books still tended to have a little bit of this sort of isolationist views, whereas I wanted this book to be a sense of, well, the southern oceans go all the way up to the South African coast and Namibian coast and Mozambican coast, and we have all these birds that come from further north, and they're part of a collective, of a continuity. So that was one of the reasons to join, let's say, the Zambia, Malawi, northern Mozambique uncharted territories to the well-charted territories of southern Africa. So that was the main reason for wanting to do that. And I mean, just look at these birds: bar-tailed trogon, white-winged apalis. Why wouldn't you want to venture just a few 100 kilometers further north from Zimbabwe into areas where you can get these incredibly cool birds and really enjoy them? There are really a bunch of amazingly cool areas, both to the north and the south of the Southern African region, that are well worth exploring. Okay, so the other thing that I think makes this book a little bit different is I wanted to get back to a philosophy of actually watching birds, looking at them. Not just a case of, okay, what's the fastest way I can describe this species to an audience and have them arrive at a species designation. There seems to be a lot of emphasis on, like, use the fewest number of words to get me to the answer that I need so that I can tick this bird and move on. It's not that simple. A lot of birds vary, and they can vary quite considerably. And I wanted us to really get a better understanding of that. You know, birds vary genetically. So this is a spike-billed lark, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And this is a map, a couple of maps from a study I did when I was still a scientist. The orange dots are my sample sites over here. And then these numbers that are from 1 to 11, those represent some of the classically defined subspecies of spike-billed lark that occur in South Africa. So I took samples from these birds and I ended up analyzing them genetically. And as you can see, we ended up with 3 very discrete groups. And these were quite well defined genetically, by the way. And these did not at all overlap with any of the classical subspecies, the way we perceive them in terms of their appearance, what we call their phenotypics, their phenology. So interestingly, the genetic variation doesn't really necessarily match with the other variation. But what we wanted to do, we're birders, we're interested in the field, so we need to be able to describe all the different ways this bird can appear. And so in the end, for the spike-billed lark, I ended up describing 9 races across the range and kind of how they appear. So we get a much better sense of, you know, birds are pale in some parts of their range, but darker. Birds are richer in some parts of their range, but duller in others. So that was really what I wanted to do with the racial variability. But more than that, you know, you've got size variation, sometimes between males and females. You've got seasonal variation between breeding and non-breeding birds. You've got age-related stuff with birds that maybe have a 5, 6, 7 year period before they become adults. You've got polymorphism, you've got molt, you've got abrasion and fading. So I really wanted, for those species where those things were important, I wanted to be able to discuss those in a way that made sense. You know, even then, some groups of birds are very, very hard to do in the space that's available in a field guide. I mean, you could write an entire book on, say, little stint and redneck stint variation. But nevertheless, this was something I really wanted to do my best at attempting to discuss. There's just a quick picture of me at the Berkeley Museum in California, looking at various sunbird skins collected by Rory Bowie. So yeah, it's really about trying to understand species variation as much as possible and subspecies variation as much as possible. And that's what I think makes this bird certainly one of the junctures of difference of this book from other books. Here's an example. One of the cool things was that I also didn't want to be prescribed into only having, you know, well, I've got to have 5 species on a plate, so I can only give this species X amount of space. But here's a yellow wagtail, and you can see we were able to take an entire plate and page of text and dedicate it to just 2 species, which I think is really cool. Able to discuss the 6 races and the 1 additional variant that isn't a race, but it's something that appears quite differently of Western yellow wagtail. So, you know, these kinds of things are really fun and cool. Here's one of Fancy Peacock's lark plates. What I want to quickly draw to your attention to here is, you know, we have 3 different races of fawn-colored lark, everything from the richly colored nominate to the darker Vincentia to one of the paler races. The variations of brown to much more plainer back to sort of more richly colored Barlow's larks. A couple of races of Karoo lark as well as juveniles. We've got a flight illustration of one of the Karoo lark complex of birds. And not just races, but also forms. So the browner plains form of red lark versus the reddish dune form. So this is where I think we do stuff that other books don't. Here's an example of a gull. This is probably the species that gets the most attention. I think it's one of the trickiest to identify of all the birds in the region. We have Cape gull up here, but all these three variants are really part of the lesser black-backed gull complex. So the same species. I split them into Baltic, Hughlins and steppe gulls, not as species, but just as groups so that we can discuss them, because each of these things is discrete and different. But we wound up with 21 illustrations and over 880 words describing the different races of lesser black-backed gull, the different age stages and morphs and wingtips and stuff like that. So yeah, again, that's the kind of difference we have between a book that's basically rushing you to a species description and a book that's trying to show you every variant and how to identify the different variants from each other, in addition to being able to nail down the species stuff. Another really cool thing about this project is that we only had two primary artists, and that was John Gale. Here was his plate of the woodland type kingfishers, and Brian Small. And the beauty of this is that you end up with a uniformity. Not only are these guys world-class artists producing some of the finest illustrations of African birds that exist on the planet, but they're beautifully uniform, so that you're not getting all this different variation in interpretation of the way a bird looks based on different artists with their own styles. And that really makes it very, very cool from that perspective. But also I think it's really great for beginners, because beginner birders, you'll always come to you and they'll sort of say, well, you know, this bird didn't quite look like this in the field. Well, I think the chances of them getting confused with these quality illustrations and with the uniformity of illustrations is much less than having 5-10 different artists participate in the book. And again, down to the text, I wanted to be able to explore birds as much as possible in the text. So that's a plate for the Jaegers. Only 3 species on the plate, and that's because there's so much complexity and involvement in juvenile stages and non-breeding plumages that I really needed that. I wanted to be able to drill down to the minimum diagnosable unit to really get into the detail, because the devil's in the details. Right, so one other thing that we tried to do differently was really tackle habitats as systematically as possible. So another cool COVID passion project is this one. It's called Habitats of Africa, and it's a book I've been involved in with Princeton University Press with co-authors Ken Behrens and Ian Campbell. And it's due for release on the 15th of January 2025. And what this book really is trying to do, and we try to use a lot of this in the Birds of Greater Southern Africa, is really give people a feel as non-botanists for how habitats work and what they mean. So, like, for example, how do you differentiate between the succulent karoo and the Nama karoo? How do you define them? What are the edaphic factors, like, you know, rainfall, exposure to sun, etc., etc.? How do those factors affect them? What does fire do? What are the drivers of these communities? Is it a winter rainfall or a summer rainfall area? How does drought affect them? How do large mammals impact their structure and their species composition, etc., etc.? So I've just included a couple of plates from the Habitat book here so you can get a feel for it. Also a quick little pitch for that while I'm at it. But we introduced a lot of this, well, these units as we define them were used in the Birds of Greater Southern Africa in the habitats section in the introduction, to try and get people, you know, a good understanding of what these habitats are. But then obviously we were also including these in the species account so that they match up. In other words, the karoo karan is really a bird that occurs in Nama karoo, succulent karoo, but also occurs in the modified anthropogenic wheat fields of the Overberg. So we try to be consistent with those and really help people understand the relationship between habitats and the birds that are found within them. And then seasonality and bird movements. This is something that's a little bit not tricky, but it's not always as straightforward as people like to think about it, because we were dealing with a region that extended from 8 degrees to nearly 60. We're dealing with a massive number of subtropical, temperate, and polar latitude habitats, right? So that seasonality really became tricky because the poles really move between summer and winter without really having much of the spring, fall, shoulder seasons. You know, these happen very quickly. It moves from nearly complete dark to nearly complete light in a very short period of time. And then in the tropics, such as in Zambia, although it does have a cooler season and a warmer season, it's really the rains that determine what happens in those places. They don't have these extreme fluctuations in seasonality. So, you know, you have a cool, dry season, you have a warm, dry season, and then you have a hot, wet season in places like Zambia or northern Mozambique, rather than a winter and a summer. So it doesn't really fit the four seasons concept. So that was kind of tricky. And then when we think about bird movements, we really need to do this a little bit more systematically in our part of the world, because a lot of us, I'm sure, when we hear about bird migration for the first time, get introduced to a barn swallow, and kind of the implication there is that this migration from the Palearctic is the most important migration. And of course it is important migration, but it's not something that is more important, say, than many of the other types of bird movement we get in the region, and I'll expand on that just now. Another kind of fun thing is we always get told, oh, barn swallows come and, you know, they leave their breeding grounds during the summer and they overwinter in Africa. I really, really detested that concept even, and it's a false concept. I'll explain to you in a little while why, but it doesn't really work for me. Okay, so one of the interesting things that we seldom think about with Palearctic migration in southern Africa is what passage migration is. So the north of the greater southern African region, including Zambia and Malawi, a lot of birds, not all of them, but a lot of birds that are migrating from the Palearctic tend to pass through there en route to reaches further south. So a good example will be black-winged pratinkhole, which comes through Zambia in October, November, and then spends most of its time, not winter, sorry, almost broke my own rules, most of the months between November and March in countries like Namibia, Botswana, and South Africa, and then it moves back north, passing through Zambia again on its way north. So that's passage migration, and we had to sort of explain that within the context of Palearctic migration. But then there's also things like, you know, the birds of the oceans of the Southern Ocean. So these birds breed on the oceanic islands. So this is black-browed albatross. And then they come north in the months of May through to August, September, where they spend our winter overwintering in southern Africa. So this is where the problem with a concept like overwinter comes from. You can't have birds coming from the Palearctic and overwintering during our summer, and then birds coming from the subantarctic islands and overwintering during our winter. It just doesn't make sense. It's a paradigm that doesn't work. And then of course you've got inter-African migrants, good example being olive bee-eater here. And when we look at some of these birds, I mean, this is really interesting. So this was a map again. I used these fun raw maps of my original illustrations rather than the ones in the book. Just thought it would be fun. But here you have olive bee-eater, and what we see here is you've got some birds along the coast, along the Mozambican coastline, are pretty much there year-round, so they're resident. Then you've got this population of birds that comes into the region only in the southern summer, the austral summer, which would be sort of October, November, December to January, to breed. And then you've got other birds that are not breeding also occurring here. So it's a real hodgepodge of different strategies for different species. European bee-eater is another fascinating one. You know, we've got Palearctic birds that come into our region between the months of September and March, where they spend their non-breeding season. And then you've got inter-African migrants that are not breeding in in Central Africa somewhere. And these birds come down to the Cape, the Northern Cape, and the Western Cape and breed down here. So it's very, very difficult to be using these concepts of overwinter, over summer, this and that, and the next thing. And they're best avoided. I'll tell you in a little bit what we ended up doing. But of course, that's not to ignore other types of movement that we get in the region. Nomadism's an important one for a subset of species in our arid regions. You know, birds like lark-like bunting, the sparrowlarks, they move around and will show up in strange places at strange times based on resource availability. Altitudinal migrant, a lot of the birds of our eastern montane regions in the temperate zone along the Drakensberg, they'll drop down when it gets super cold and move back up, higher up when it gets warmer again. And then another set of movements that we've pretty much ignored in a lot of other kinds of sort of books and other literature in the region is just local movements. You know, a lot of our birds, even like white-eyes, seem to move around randomly and get replaced. So, you know, the white-eyes in your garden, they may move somewhere else and get replaced by white-eyes from a different region in your garden. So it's not just straight up and down. So what did we do in our book? Well, first of all, overwinter became a banished word, not allowed to use it. I'd love to change that rhetoric or terminology forever. We avoided both the words winter and summer as much as possible. It wasn't always possible. I think we ended up using it 3 or 4 times in the book, but we avoided it because really the north of the region doesn't really have a winter or a summer. And it was much better to just say the bird is either breeding in the area or it's not breeding. It's either resident or it's a migrant or visitor, and then allocate months to it so that you could know wherever you were in your region what those months were. So for example, you know, October in South Africa might be spring, but in Zambia it might sort of not be spring, it might be the middle of the or early in the wet season or something like that. So that was really the way we handled seasonality and bird movements, and I think it's a little bit different from the way it's been done in other books. And then one of the last things we did, which was a lot of fun, was added what we call the Vagrants watch list. So this was birds that are potential in the region but are easily overlooked. You know, some warblers, things that have got doppelganger birds in the region that are already there. So, you know, something like Savvy's warbler, which would be a heck of difficult to tell from river warbler if you just got a glimpse. And you would almost need to know how to tell these birds apart before you even look at them. Or knowing that, for example, a common nightingale would show a rustier tail than thrush nightingale, something like that. So basically, if you do the homework on these birds, you kind of go into the field pre-armed, ready to know what to look for on a bird before it shows up. Of course, photography has helped us nail these things down a lot more easily and comprehensively, but it's still really, really cool to know the stuff and to know what you should be photographing. So the Vagrants watch list was really the last thing we did in the book that I think makes it significantly different from previous books. Were there any controversial decisions? There always are with these things. So I mean, we spoke about breaching the Kunene and the Zambezi rivers. I just feel it's time to have a book that did that and showed what was beyond these regions we traditionally bird in Southern Africa. A lot of people that said, why didn't I include Angola? Well, there are a couple of reasons for this. I know it would have made sense from a regional perspective, but it did basically bump up the number of species to be treated by nearly 200. There's a lot of rainforest birds in Angola, and that would have made the book at least 20% larger and a little bit more wieldy, probably taking it out of the category of being a good field guide. And the other reason was because Bloomsbury, who are the primary publishers of this book, are already doing a book on Angola that they will publish. So no real reason to do one in this if they're already doing another one. And then last but maybe not least, the vernacular names or the common names. You know, I know people love their Korans and their Luris and stuff like that. I do use them as alternative names in places. But when we think about it really carefully, we're including 9 different countries here. There's Portuguese spoken in Mozambique. There's Chichewa in Malawi. There's 17 regional languages overall. And so it kind of made sense not to try and treat them. We decided to kind of go global, given the number of countries we were dealing with. So there's a thing called the Working Group on Avian Checklists, which is busy trying to unify all the major bird checklists around the world and make sure that the common names are the same. So we try to use those mostly, although there are a couple of variants, as there always are. And then we know that there's great organizations like BirdLife South Africa working on names, local names for local people. And this is crucial. It's a crucial project. I'm very supportive of it. But I think NGOs all around should do the same. It would be great if there was a list in Zambia and Angola and Mozambique for these birds for everybody to use, local people to use. But I think that project sits somewhere else outside of the realms of a field guide. And while I'm happy to support it, I really didn't think it was a smart use of the space to try and deal with 17 regional languages and include everybody. I wanted everybody to be included, whether you were in Angola or South Africa. So that was another reason for just sticking with the English names and the main global names. One other thing that's a little bit tricky, of course, is subspecies. So we did our best to delineate these taxa all around the region, but I'm sure that there's much to be learned and discovered, and I'm hoping that, you know, it's a challenge for users of the book to go out and not prove us wrong, but to show where we've erred incorrectly. I do think that there are probably mistakes already in the book, and it's a matter of discovering where those mistakes are. You know, the book did its best to present what's in the literature, but I think when you go out in the field, then now the book sort of says, this subspecies that happens to occur in the Western Karoo is supposed to look like this, but it doesn't. Please feed that back to us. We're dead keen to use this as an opportunity to learn more about the birds in our region and to discover stuff. So I'm excited about that. I wouldn't say it's controversial. I think it's a fun element, but yeah. So what about the future? Well, folks have asked us about an ebook, and there is an ebook already available, published by Bloomsbury. Will there be an app? I'm not sure. If I make an app, I want it to be really, really outstanding. There are already incredibly good apps for many of the parts of the Greater Southern Africa region already available. I don't want to produce a B-grade app, so I'm busy speaking to the publishers at the moment, but unless it's going to be an A-grade app, we probably won't be producing one. What is kind of fun is we are looking at paring it down a little bit. It is a marginally hefty book, but we will be doing certain country field guides. Our first is going to be to Zambia and Malawi, so there will be a standalone field guide which will, you know, be around 800 species, which makes it a whole lot more portable than the current close to 1200 species that we have. And if there's demand elsewhere, we'll do that. We also want to make the book or the books going forward as good as possible. So if you find out any problems or anything, please communicate with us about this. We're keen to know. So I guess the next real question about the future is there room for a Greater Southern Africa birding region? I think there is, and I'm going to tell you why. So it would look a little bit like this. It would include the territory covered by the book, but also include Angola. This makes a lot of sense, both from a avifaunal and a logistical perspective. It shares the vast majority of its birds with the Greater Southern Africa region, and it's connected both by flights but also by roads and easy access to Namibia and Zambia. So it really, really makes sense to include Angola. It makes a really, really cool region with, you know, I think 1,373 birds in it. That's over 55% of Africa's entire avifauna. And I think it would be just incredible if we could have this new region and really start exploring it properly. Anyway, so you'll probably say, well, why? Why do this? We already have a region. We do have a region, and we have a great region. Southern Africa will always be the #1 region. This is not a competitor. It's an adjunct region. It's an addition. It's something else to consider. A little bit like when you have your urban 150-kilometer regions around your urban areas, or whether you've got a Southern African or a Lesotho or a KwaZulu-Natal list or an Eastern Cape list. It's a different thing. It's just it's a different bit of fun to add to your birding in the region. I think it would be particularly appealing to a certain subset of people. There are wider regions available in other parts of the world. The Western Palearctic is a good one. So you have British or Swiss or Swedish birders who have their, Sweden or Swiss lists, but then they'll pursue the Western Palearctic. And this has been a fabulous way of getting people to go birding in parts of the fringes of the Western Palearctic that wouldn't have had nearly as many birders in the past. I think it would be particularly fun for people who are fairly significant large listers in the region. I mean, if you're sitting on 800 or 850, you're essentially like a vulture, just circling around, waiting for your next, for your next vagrant to show up so you can go and twitch it. So if you've already seen 98% of the resident avifauna of a region, wouldn't it be fun to have an expanded region that you could go and visit? It would also be fun to adventurous birders like me when I was a kid and exploring Zambia and Malawi for the first time. This is the time when people who have these dreams of going off and finding firsts for countries can go and do that. And I mean, resident firsts. So there's absolutely no doubt that I think that there's a possibility of finding a new species to science in one of these countries on their borders. Certainly new subspecies and other really, really cool discoveries to be had. So I really think it would be a fun adjunct to what's already existing in our region. And then the other cool thing, I mean, I haven't been on a flock yet, but I really, really should. But my understanding is that, you sort of leave Durban or Cape Town and then you get past the 200 nautical mile limit, and then all of a sudden you can only list those birds on your Africa list or on your world list, and then you get closer to Marion and you enter the territorial waters of South Africa and you can put those on your South Africa list. It's pretty messy. If you have this overarching region that spreads all the way through those oceans, there's a Greater Southern Africa list that you can now use for any of your vicarious seabird watching. It also means that BirdLife South Africa could be doing sea trips to nowhere off of Angola or off of Mozambique to go look for tropical specialties and stuff like that. So, as we can see here, there's this connection between these oceanic birds that occur on important places like Marion and Prince Edward that us as Southern Africans and BirdLife South Africa has got a responsibility for in terms of their conservation and how they connect to us. It makes sense to have a Greater Southern African region that we can include these on. These feel more connected to us rather than just an Africa or a world list. So I think that would be a fun reason to have a GSA list. And then, of course, improved ornithological knowledge on some of the least known areas in Africa, whether it's Angola, northern Zambia, northern Mozambique. There's some incredible things to be found. This is a vermiculated fishing owl that Errol de Beer discovered in 2011. What a cool thing it would be to go and discover on the fringes of one of these regions. And then, of course, there's transnational promotion possibilities. The Kaza or the Kavango Zambezi area is a major conservation initiative now underway to look at the Okavango catchment and what can be done. And these days it's important. Funders are generally giving to transnational projects and things like that. So I really think we have an opportunity here to be more inclusive in terms of the countries that we include. Have people collaborate and cooperate on their conservation initiatives because everything is connected. So yeah, when we think about the project and its conservation benefits, I think we can make better birders with the book, people who pay more attention to races and some of the interesting variations there. And with that, you have better citizen scientists and more discoveries get made. We've got chances for international collaboration. And also, almost always, once a book comes along, tourism follows. So definitely within birding, we tend to find that regions without dedicated field guides to them generally don't get birding tour companies such as Tropical Birding going to them because few people have an interest, especially internationally. But now once you have a field guide, I'm pretty sure there'll be an uptick in demand for birding tours to Zambia and Malawi, and that'll come with more support for local guides, for local operators to be operating in places like Zambia and Malawi. And then of course, that just leads to, it's kind of like a positive feedback cycle where more gets more. So once a handful of initial people go out and do this, then more people will want to visit these places because they read about what people are seeing and the highlights of enjoying a new region. And last but not least, of course, we have the fundraising again for things like Flock to Anywhere. So I just see real potential winners here, folks. So anyway, that's pretty much it. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the chat and really appreciate your time. If you guys want to know more about the project, I just would like to quickly direct you to a website that I've created called, and it's a mouthful, but birdsofgreatersouthernafrica.com. So please head on over there or chat to me on keith@tropicalbirding.com. I'm available on either. Really keen to hear what you think of the book or what you would like to see it do. Down at the bottom right hand side over here, if you haven't got the book yet, you really should go buy it. It's available at the BirdLife South Africa shop for a ridiculous price of 450 Rand. Please go ahead and get yourself a copy and give conservation wings. Help support BirdLife. Buy it through them. Thanks guys, really appreciate you listening. Hope you enjoyed it. Bye. Hi everybody.
Well, John, that was great. It is a great pity that Keith isn't here to answer any questions. But yeah, that was a really good presentation, and I really like what he's done with the book and the new directions that he's taken. Especially the kind of habitat focus and the change in that terminology that he mentioned around migrants. That's quite a novel way to do it.
Yeah, no, agreed. And from somebody who has the actual book, it's incredible. It really is. I mean, I've spent many hours stuck behind the pages of the book, and it really does open your mind. What Keith has said in terms of it really opening your eyes to areas that we have been, it's been ingrained on us to not really consider because it's beyond these imaginary boundaries. All of a sudden it just brings things into perspective. So it's really a phenomenal book, and definitely support the whole notion of a greater Southern Africa.
Yeah, it's not something that I really think about that often, but yeah, I think the arguments he put forward are pretty convincing, and I liked his punt for our flock voyages. So those of you who maybe don't know, we are heading down towards Marion Island in January next year for Flock to Marion again. So yeah, if anyone's interested in that, please head on over to the BirdLife South Africa webpage, and you can find out more details there. And then also I want to say on the topic of migratory birds, we will have our colleague Jessica Wilmot giving a webinar. I just must look up the date, the 15th of October, to coincide with World Migratory Bird Day, and she'll be talking about her work to try and conserve some of these migrant birds that we get in South Africa. So if anyone is interested in the phenomenon of migration, then please do join in for Jessica's talk in October. So there are two questions in the Q&A box. The first one was from Warren, asking why Angola has been omitted and saying, I always imagined the country would play a key role in a Southern Africa picture. And luckily enough for us, Keith did answer that question in his talk. For those who maybe weren't paying attention or missed it, I think he said it was because it would add a whole suite of new species and just make the book a little bit too unwieldy. I think he mentioned some more of the tropical rainforesty areas. And also, did I hear him correctly that he said there was an Angola specific book coming out from the same publishers?
Correct, yeah. So same publishers will be doing a whole book by itself for Angola, because yeah, I mean, it's one thing having a field guide or field companion, but it's different if one's walking around with the equivalent of an entire library. So I think the
Exactly.
publisher is
Yes.
trying to avoid that.
Yeah. And then the second question was from Marlies, saying, I've been made aware that birds, when calling, can have regional accents. For example, the Zitting cisticola in Denmark would have a slightly call to one in Portugal. And yeah, that's absolutely correct. And Fancy actually gave a good summation on in his talk on, when was it, Tuesday, about regional dialects for birds. So if anyone is interested, you can head on over to our YouTube channel and watch Fancy's talk. But basically he likened it to regional accents in humans. And I see someone has asked in the chat how they find the recordings from the other talks this week, and I'm just going to paste it into the chat box now. But otherwise, just go on to YouTube and search for BirdLife South Africa, and it should come up. Yeah, that's all the questions, which I'm glad for. It is a great pity that Keith couldn't be here, but I think his talk was comprehensive and gave a good overview of the book, and I hope it's convinced many of you to go and buy a copy. So John, I don't know if you have anything else to say, otherwise I think we can wrap up.
Yeah, just a massive thank you to all of the viewers, and just remember to head over, also linking nicely to that question of how do we watch the rest of this weekend's or week's recordings rather, and of course you need to go over and like and subscribe the BirdLife South Africa YouTube channel. Then you're not going to miss anything. It's fantastic. It's a win-win. And of course, don't forget that there is going to be events live streamed on Saturday directly from the South African Bird Fair. Thank you, Christina, for dealing with me and my technical difficulties, and the viewers as well, and I look forward to the next episode of Conservation Conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you mustn't worry about any technical, like techno gremlins, as Melissa always called them. They happen to the best of us, so we forgive you, and we know that you'll get into your stride in no time. So yeah, on that note, we will be back to our kind of more regular Conservation Conversations programming in 2 weeks' time, or just under 2 weeks' time. And the next webinar will be also from another BirdLife South Africa colleague, Justin Henry, who's recently started at BirdLife, and he is working on vultures. So he'll be giving a talk on his work around lead poisoning and vultures in honor of World Vulture Day. So yeah, I think that is all from our side. Please do join us again in 2 weeks' time. And other than that, thank you for watching and good night.